The fog had come down thick that evening, heavy as wool draped across the pines. If you've ever walked a woodland path when the mist rolls in, you know how it swallows sound. Footsteps muffled, breath sharp, each twig snapping louder than it should. For the siblings who set out on that trail, the fog felt almost alive, curling between trees, pressing against their shoulders. They were ordinary children from an ordinary town, a brother with a compass tucked in his pocket, proud of how the needle spun, a sister with a scarf tied tight, its red fringe fluttering even in the damp. They'd walked that trail dozens of times, chasing each other toward the creek. On that evening, October 12th, 2010, they did the same thing they always did. But the woods did not behave the way they always had. Neighbours remembered the day clearly. The air had felt strange, warmer than it should have been for autumn. A dog barked at nothing near the tree line. Hunters swore they heard laughter in the fog, though none could say from which direction. At 5:42 p.m, a woman driving past the trailhead saw the two figures running hand in hand, their shapes already blurred by mist. She smiled, thinking they looked like shadows playing tag. That was the last certain sighting. By 6:15, their mother called them in for supper. No answer. She set bread on the table, checked the window, then the yard, her voice sharper each time. By 6:30, the plates grew cold. By 7, the fog pressed heavier, the house too quiet, as though sound itself had retreated. When their father retraced the trail with a lantern, his light bobbing weakly in the mist, he found only fragments, the scarf snagged on a branch, its red fringe dark with dew, a circle pressed in the mud where someone had set down a compass, and silence, always silence. The search began with urgency. Flashlights cut across trees, dogs strained against their leashes. Deputies called names that faded instantly into the grey. Each shout seemed to bounce back without echo, as though the fog absorbed voices whole. At 8:45, a hunter swore he saw movement. Two figures just ahead on the ridge, shapes shifting in and out of view. He shouted. They didn't answer. When he climbed closer, there was nothing there but empty ground and the smell of wet pine. He described it later as like chasing shadows you can't touch. The search stretched until midnight. Lanterns flickered out, batteries drained. Still nothing. The woods gave no broken branches, no drag marks, no trail of belongings. By dawn, the town was already gathering at the trailhead, faces tight, voices low. Two children had stepped into the fog. The fog had swallowed them. It wasn't just absence, it was contradiction. A scarf without its owner, a compass without its carrier, no footprints beyond a certain point, as though the ground itself had erased them. By the second night, when hope began to fray, the sheriff gave his first statement. 2 miners, missing in fog conditions. Search ongoing. His words were clipped, clinical, offering little more than protocol. But the mother's words carried more weight. Standing at the trail's edge, voice breaking into the mist, she shouted, "Bring them home before the forest decides to keep them." No one forgot that line. In the weeks that followed, it became part of the folklore, that the woods decide who they keep and the fog hides what it must. The trailhead became a shrine. Candles were left at the tree where the scarf had hung. Small children dared each other to touch the compass pinned to the sheriff's board, its glass cracked, its needle frozen. And all the while, the question grew louder. How could 2 children vanish in a place so familiar, under so many eyes? By the end of the week, the town accepted the impossible. The woods had taken them. But the truth would not stay hidden forever. 10 years later, when flames tore through the valley, burning away brush and roots, the ground gave up what the fog had kept. The storm was only beginning. Before the fog, before the fire, life for the siblings was steady, ordinary, and almost painfully simple. They lived in a small white house at the edge of town, its porch sagging just enough to creak when you stepped onto it. From their bedroom window, they could see the beginning of the tree line where the trail disappeared into shadow. To them, the woods were not ominous. They were a playground stitched into childhood itself. Every morning followed the same pattern. Their mother set out thick slices of bread, buttered and wrapped in wax paper, alongside 2 apples and a flask of water. Their father polished the compass the boy insisted on carrying, though he laughed every time at how much pride a child could take in a needle spinning north. The girl always fussed with her scarf, a red one passed down from her grandmother. Its threads had begun to fray at the edges, but she refused to take it off even on warm days. It was, she said, her shield against the woods. Neighbours remembered the children's rituals as vividly as their own. At the market, the boy would buy peppermint sticks, breaking them in half to share with his sister as they walked home. At church, they would sit in the third pew, whispering secret jokes while their mother frowned and their father tapped his watch against the wooden bench to remind them to be still. At dusk, they played in the yard until their mother's voice cut through the air. Before supper. That phrase became more than routine. It was the anchor that pulled them home. The woods themselves seemed to accept their presence. They knew the bends of the creek, the logs that served as bridges, the hollowed stump that echoed like a drum when you knocked on it. On weekends, they carried notebooks where they wrote down discoveries, feathers, paw prints, leaves pressed flat between the pages. The boy would sketch a rough map of each path, insisting one day he would know the forest better than the hunters who trailed it for decades. And yet, for all their ease, small shadows lingered. Their father once found the compass lying on the windowsill, its needle twitching back and forth despite no magnet near. Their mother swore she sometimes heard the scarf whipping in the night wind, even when it was hanging on a peg indoors. The children dismissed such things, laughing at the idea of their ordinary treasures holding anything sinister. To them, a scarf was just fabric, a compass was just a toy. But to the adults, those objects would later become proof, anchors to cling to when the woods swallowed more than sound. Neighbours noticed unease too, though they rarely spoke of it until later. One remembered the boy's sudden silence mid-sentence, staring into the trees as though listening to something just out of reach. Another recalled the girl standing at the trailhead one morning, scarf fluttering, lips moving as if she were answering a voice no one else could hear. At the time, such moments passed unnoticed, dismissed as quirks of childhood. In retrospect, they became warning signs, sharpened by hindsight's cruel light. The day before the disappearance was unremarkable in every way. They ate bread and apples, collected feathers, and brought home a stray puppy that their parents gently insisted could not stay. That evening, their father wound the watch he wore daily, setting it carefully on the table as the children leaned in to hear its steady tick. The sound filled the room, ordinary and soothing, marking time as faithfully as it always had. None of them knew it would be the last ordinary supper before silence replaced its rhythm. In later years, those ordinary details, bread, scarf, compass, watch, would haunt the family more than any newspaper headline, because each was a fragment of routine, a piece of normal life, transformed by absence into sinister tokens. What once anchored the children to home became echoes of everything they had lost. The neighbours said it best, though none wanted to admit it aloud. "If something so ordinary could vanish into fog," one woman whispered, "then none of us are safe from losing the things we love." The family remembered that line when they set the table the next night. 2 plates untouched, bread growing hard, a watch ticking louder than it ever had. Yet one small detail didn't fit. October 12th, 2010. The clock on the kitchen wall read 4:07 p.m. when the siblings left the house, scarf tied, compass pocketed. Their mother called after them, "Before supper?" The boy raised his hand in a lazy salute. The girl laughed, tugging him toward the tree line. Those were the last words their mother ever heard. At 4:30, a neighbour stacking wood saw them darting across the yard that bordered the trail. He remembered the red scarf trailing behind, bright as a flag in the pale mist. At 5 another neighbour swore she heard a whistle, sharp and brief, though she could not say which child made it. At 5:20, the grocer's son thought he glimpsed them running hand in hand past the fence. Ordinary sightings, fragments of routine. Yet each would become testimony, dissected and rehashed for years. By 5:42, the fog had thickened. The woman driving past the trailhead gave the clearest account. She saw 2 figures near the ridge, blurred but unmistakably children. One turned, lifting a hand as though waving. She thought they looked carefree, shadows at play. 10 years later, she still regretted not stopping the car. The trail itself carried no clues at first glance. Deputies later found a candy wrapper tucked in moss, peppermint stick broken in half. They logged it as possible evidence, though it might have been left days earlier. Still, it told a story. 2 children treating the woods as their second home, unaware the fog was already closing in. Contradictions began almost immediately. At 6 a hunter returning from the opposite ridge insisted he heard children's laughter no more than 30 yards away. He swore he followed the sound until it faded into silence. Another man claimed he saw no one, only fog so thick he could barely see his boots. Witness statements overlapped, blurred like the mist itself. The mother's memory carried sharper weight. At 6:15 she called again, voice echoing into trees. No answer. She lit the lamp in the kitchen window, the one the children always used as a beacon. From that moment, her heart told her something was wrong. The scarf appeared first, snagged on a low branch at the half-mile mark. Damp but untorn, its fringe dark with dew, it seemed placed rather than ripped. A few yards beyond, the ground showed a circle pressed into mud, as though a compass had been set there. Deputies photographed both, tagging them carefully, already whispering the same thought. Objects without owners, anchors without anchors. By 7 dusk had fallen. Searchers carried lanterns, beams cutting short arcs through the grey. Dogs strained at leashes, but their noses led nowhere. Trails evaporating at the edge of the creek. A deputy wrote later, it was as though the ground itself had erased their steps. And still, contradictions multiplied. A farmer swore he heard a girl calling faintly, "Wait!" near the southern bend. Another insisted he saw 2 figures vanish into fog near the quarry road. No proof, no consistency, only fragments sharpened by fear. By 8 the family gathered at the trailhead. The father's lantern glowed weak against the growing dark. He walked into the woods, calling their names until his voice cracked. Searchers held him back when he tried to push deeper, their own unease clear in their eyes. Neighbours stood silently, clutching candles, staring at the trail that seemed to breathe fog back at them. The sheriff gave his first field report at 9. 2 miners missing, no signs of struggle, search ongoing. The words were clipped, almost indifferent, as though protocol could blunt the dread. But for those who stood at the trail's edge, the reality pressed heavier. 2 children had stepped into familiar woods and never returned. The heartbeat moment came not from the officials, but from the mother. Standing at the edge of the trees, scarf clutched in her fist, she whispered the line that would echo for years. The fog doesn't give back what it takes. And that was the last time anyone saw them alive. The search began as all searches do, with urgency, with belief, with the fragile conviction that children could not simply vanish. At 6:45 a.m. the following morning, deputies gathered at the trailhead, maps spread across the hood of a squad car. Volunteers circled with lanterns, dogs tugged at leashes, and neighbours pressed coffee into each other's hands. It was chaos straining to be order. The first sweeps followed the creek, men and women forming lines, calling names that echoed back in strange, broken fragments. Some swore they heard responses, a boy's laughter, a girl's shout, though no direction could ever be pinned down. Others shook their heads, muttering that fog plays tricks on ears. Contradictions grew by the hour. One dog handler insisted his shepherd caught a trail near the ridge, pawing frantically at the earth. A second dog refused to move at all, whining low, tail tucked. Deputies argued over which instinct to trust, their voices tight with exhaustion before the first day had even ended. At nightfall, the search turned ritualistic. Families gathered at the trailhead with candles, their flames bobbing like fragile stars against the mist. The children's mother carried a loaf of bread, leaving slices at the edge of the trees as though to lure her children home by scent. The father walked beside her, lantern raised, compass in his other hand. He tilted it toward deputies, his voice sharp. If this needle stops, it means they're close. They humoured him, though none understood how a compass could find what the fog had hidden. The daughter of a neighbour carried a smaller lantern, her hands trembling as she lit it. Years later, she recalled the sheriff's instruction, "Keep it high, don't let it go out." That detail became folklore itself, passed around in retellings of the search. Even now, people repeat it as though it carries agency. If you carried that lantern, would you have let it die? By the third day, hope and panic had fused into something heavier. Volunteers tied ribbons to mailboxes, blue and red strips fluttering in the autumn wind. Each ribbon meant another block searched, another home lit with prayers. Some whispered that the ribbons were not just markers, but offerings, bargains with the woods themselves. Yet even as the rituals grew, the evidence did not. No broken branches, no drag marks, no discarded shoes. The scarf and compass remained the only tangible proof. Deputies widened the grid, pushing into the quarry road, then beyond to the hunting cabins. The maps grew cluttered with circles and X's, lines scratched and redrawn, until the paper itself seemed to mirror the confusion. At dusk on the fourth day, the sheriff made a statement. His voice cracked, though whether from fatigue or unease no one could tell. "We continue to search every path," he said, "but the fog has made visibility difficult." Behind him, neighbours murmured, unsatisfied. A mother asked the question none wanted to voice. If they're not in the woods, where else could they be? Panic simmered. Rumours sprouted that someone had taken the children, that a stranger's truck had been seen near the trail, that the forest itself had swallowed them whole. Each whisper fed the next until the line between search and séance blurred. People brought relics to the trailhead, old watches, rosaries, photographs, laying them at the base of the sycamore tree like offerings. The unopened wall of silence grew heavier each day. Deputies slammed doors harder, voices sharpened, dogs grew restless. By the end of the first week, hope had thinned to a thread, fraying with each unanswered call into the woods, and yet the family refused to let despair claim the ground. On the seventh night, the mother lit a candle and placed it on the kitchen windowsill, just as she had the night her children failed to return. "They'll see it," she whispered. "Wherever they are, they'll see it." But the fog rolled back across the valley and the candle flickered against glass that only reflected her own face. The unopened wall remained. By the second week, the search had begun to wear itself thin. Volunteers dwindled, dogs refused to pull, and deputies shuffled papers more often than they walked the woods. It was in that lull that the sheriff stood on the courthouse steps and offered the first official theory. His words landed like stones. "There is no evidence of foul play," he said, his voice clipped, rehearsed. "At this time, we cannot rule out the possibility the children left voluntarily." The crowd stiffened. Voluntarily? The word rang hollow, offensive. These were children who obeyed curfews, who carried peppermint sticks in their pockets, who ran home when their mother called before supper. The suggestion that they had simply walked away felt like betrayal. Yet the headline ran the next morning anyway. Probable runaways. Neighbours carried the paper to their porches, shaking their heads. Some muttered about stress at home or tension between siblings. Others, unwilling to accept silence, clung to the idea that voluntary disappearance was easier than the alternative. It was tidy. It was simple. And it shifted the burden from the town to the children themselves. Inside the Hale household, the headline was a wound. Their mother crumpled the paper in her fist, her voice breaking. They left their plates on the table. They left their shoes by the door. Children don't run away into fog without supper waiting. Her husband said nothing, just turned the compass over in his hand until the glass caught the weak light. Contradictions sharpened the family's anger. Reports claimed no struggle was found on the trail, yet deputies had catalogued the scarf hanging too neatly on a branch. Reports claimed no personal belongings were missing, yet the compass had been found pressed into mud, not pocketed. Reports claimed children sometimes ran from discipline, yet every neighbour had spoken of their loyalty to routine. The paperwork smoothed over these jagged edges, but the family could not ignore them. At a town meeting, a teacher stood to speak. "If they ran away, where are the footprints? Where is the trail out of town? Where did they go with no food, no coats?" Her words drew murmurs, but the officials offered only silence in return. The sheriff tapped his microphone, repeated the phrase, "No evidence of foul play." It was a phrase that sounded like fact, but felt like evasion. The mother's reply cut sharper. Standing at the back of the room, she raised the scarf high. Its fringe shook in her hand as her voice carried, "They didn't take this with them. Someone left it here for us to find." Gasps rippled across the crowd. To the officials, the scarf was nothing more than misplaced fabric. To the family, it was proof, a breadcrumb, a contradiction the paperwork refused to hold. Days later, another report stamped the case as inactive pending new evidence. One deputy admitted privately that they were out of leads, resources stretched thin, but on the form, it looked neat, it looked final. Yet paper trails end. Secrets do not. In the years to come, that contrast would gnaw at the family. For every headline that labelled the siblings runaways, there was a photograph of their empty chairs at the dinner table. For every report that declared no evidence, there was a scarf folded into a drawer, a compass set carefully by the bed. For every official statement that silenced doubt, there was a mother's voice calling into the fog. "Before supper?" Unanswered still. The sheriff's neat statement might have convinced a courtroom, but it never convinced the family. Inside the small white house at the edge of town, grief did not sound like acceptance. It sounded like the tick of a watch placed on the table each night, steady, insistent, louder than paper or headlines. It had belonged to their grandfather, passed to their father, and the children had loved its rhythm. They tapped it with their small fingers, listening as though it held secrets. After the disappearance, the watch became something else. Proof, because time does not simply stop without cause. And the family knew their time together had been interrupted, not abandoned. At first, their resistance was quiet. Their mother wrote letters to the sheriff, underlining contradictions in red ink. The scarf placed too neatly, the compass pressed into mud, the absence of footprints. Their father stood at the post office counter, demanding to know why packages vanished in storms but never entire children. Clerks looked away, unwilling to answer. Soon the resistance grew louder. At a town hall meeting, the mother held up the watch in her fist, the tick audible in the microphone. "A watch doesn't lie," she said. "It keeps steady until something breaks it. My children were steady too. If they had run, we would have heard them. They would have written. They would have said goodbye." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some murmured support. Others clung to the sheriff's neat phrases. But in that moment, the watch ticked louder than their doubts. Neighbours remembered smaller details that supported the family's certainty. A grocer recalled how the girl always counted coins twice, never careless. A teacher remembered the boy's habit of drawing maps of the woods, labelling each bend of the creek, each hollowed stump. These were children rooted in routine, in detail, in presence. Not the kind who drift away without trace. The family also began dismantling rumours. When someone suggested the siblings had been unhappy at home, the father cut them short. Children unhappy at home don't leave their supper plates waiting. They don't run into fog with only scarves and candy sticks. When another whispered about a possible abduction, the mother shook her head. If someone had dragged them, the ground would have shown it. If they had cried out, I would have heard them. Their certainty was not blind hope. It was born from contradiction. Every object recovered, scarf, compass, candy wrapper, pointed to children who had been interrupted mid-ritual, not plotting escape. The sheriff's theory explained nothing of these fragments. The family's counter-theory explained everything. They began keeping notebooks, each page filled with questions. Why did the scarf look placed rather than torn? Why did the compass needle twitch on the windowsill days before? Why did the watch sound louder in the nights after they vanished? The questions stacked like bricks, forming a wall of resistance against official silence. The daughter of a cousin remembered one night clearly. She sat at the family's table as the watch ticked between them. The mother pressed her hand to the wooden surface and whispered, "Listen, it ticks too loud now." That's because it refuses to be silenced. The phrase stuck. Within weeks, neighbours repeated it at church pews and grocery lines, on porches after dark. A watch that ticks too loud refuses to be silenced. It became more than metaphor. It became a form of protest against the sheriff's paperwork, a way of keeping the children alive in words when their bodies could not be found. Officials dismissed it, of course. They labelled the family emotional, unstable, unwilling to accept reality. But reality itself whispered otherwise, because time does not erase contradictions, it sharpens them. And, in the Hale home, the watch ticked louder with every passing night. If the family clung to the ticking of a watch, the town clung to whispers. In the absence of proof, stories took root like vines in cracked stone. They grew fast, wild, tangled, each retelling adding another twist until no one could tell fact from folklore. The first rumour came from the tavern. A logger swore he'd seen a pale sedan idling near the trailhead in the weeks before the children vanished. He described its windows tinted too dark, its engine running long after dusk. By the second week, the sedan had become a phantom car, said to trail them every afternoon, headlights cutting through fog no one else saw. The second rumour sprouted from the post office. A clerk whispered that letters had gone missing, cheques never delivered, envelopes already torn before reaching their destinations. She suggested the children might have stumbled onto something bigger than themselves, carrying secrets that someone wanted buried. By the time it reached the diner counter, the rumour had turned into a story of stolen government mail, and the children silenced for knowing too much. Then came the wildest story of all. A drifter passing through claimed he had given a ride to a girl with a red scarf and a boy with a compass months after the disappearance. He swore they told him they were leaving town, starting over somewhere new. The newspaper ran a headline, "Runaways Spotted?" For a brief week, hope flared that the siblings were alive. But when the man's description crumbled under scrutiny, hope collapsed harder than before. Children absorbed the rumours too, weaving them into rhyme. Step in fog, you won't come back, scarf goes red, then fades to black. They chanted it in schoolyards, laughing nervously, daring each other to walk to the trailhead at night. Parents hushed them, but the rhyme outlived silence, etched into the town's memory like a scar. Hunters told darker tales. One claimed he had found a circle of stones deep in the woods, arranged as though for ritual. Another swore he heard 2 sets of footsteps behind him one night, though when he turned only fog curled through the branches. He muttered in the tavern, "They're still walking, still lost. The woods don't let go." Listeners nodded, some uneasy, some enthralled. Even church pews could not keep silence pure. A deacon suggested the children were called away by forces unseen. A punishment or a test. Mothers flinched at the words, clutching their own children tighter, yet whispers lingered in the air like incense long after service ended. The family dismissed these rumours with fury. "They were here," the mother repeated. "They were at my table. They ate my bread. They carried their notebooks. Don't turn them into ghost stories." But she could not stop the tide. Whispers travel faster than facts, and beneath them all lay one unshakable contradiction. For every story of abduction, for every myth of runaways, for every whispered tale of rituals, the scarf and compass remained. Objects placed too deliberately to be coincidence, anchors that refused to vanish. Neighbours sometimes lowered their voices, glancing at the house where the family still lived. "If he was so steady," one grocer muttered, "how could he vanish?" Another answered without hesitation, "The fog takes steady ones first." That was the cruelest truth of rumours. They weren't meant to solve the mystery. They were meant to survive it. And survive they did. Time did not erase the absence. It hardened it. The woods still stood at the edge of town. Fog still rolled down from the ridge each autumn, and the creek still whispered under its banks. But the laughter of 2 children no longer threaded through those sounds. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, like static that would not clear. In the Hale house, absence became routine. 2 chairs sat empty at the dinner table, polished but untouched. Coats hung on their pegs by the door, brushed each spring but never worn again. Their mother lit a candle in the window every October 12th, the flame trembling against glass. Each year she placed a slice of bread beside it, whispering, "For supper, always for supper." Neighbours carried their own rituals. On anniversaries, children tied ribbons to mailboxes, blue and red strips fluttering like signals into the wind. A baker left peppermint sticks on his counter each October, refusing payment, saying, "They liked them once, maybe they still do." Hunters who passed the trailhead left offerings, a coin, a twig of pine, a folded prayer, dropped quietly into the dirt. But rituals did not soothe contradictions. Some nights the mother swore she heard footsteps in the yard, soft and deliberate. Once she opened the door and found a candy wrapper on the porch rail, damp with dew. Another time she found the compass needle twitching, though no magnets, no metal, no cause explained the movement. She logged these moments in a notebook, calling them fragments, proof the children were still reaching back through the fog. The town, however, began to move on. New families arrived, never knowing the children's faces. The rhyme survived longer than the details. Step in fog, you won't come back. Teenagers chanted it as they walked the ridge at night, daring each other to vanish. For them, it was folklore. For the family, it was wound. Dreams threaded through the silence. Their father dreamed of the scarf, its fringe snagged on branches, never tearing. Their mother dreamed of a watch ticking inside the trees, louder than her own heartbeat. Their surviving daughter dreamed of walls patched and unpatched as though something pressed from the other side. Each morning they carried those dreams like relics, unprovable, yet impossible to forget. Even officials could not ignore the persistence of ritual. 10 years after the disappearance, the sheriff admitted in a private interview, "It's strange how they left no trace. Strange how the family keeps marking the date. It's like the case is closed on paper but still open in the ground." His words never reached print, but they lived in the family's notebooks, underlined twice in red. Agency belonged to those who remembered. And the family refused to surrender it. They told themselves each October, "If you walk that road, would you dare touch the stone?" It was not just metaphor. It was challenge, a reminder that silence was not proof and fog was not explanation. Years passed. The town paved new sidewalks, built new homes, painted fresh lines on roads. But the trailhead remained untouched. Its wooden sign leaned with rot, moss thick on its posts. No one wanted to replace it. No one wanted to erase it. The fog still gathered there, like a living thing. And so, time did not heal. It calcified. It turned questions into scars, rituals into warnings, silence into folklore. Because time hardens. It does not heal. The summer of 2020 was the hottest the valley had known in years. Weeks without rain left the woods brittle, each leaf crackling at the touch. Then, in late August, lightning struck the ridge. Fire leapt from crown to crown, roaring through dry timber until the valley glowed red. Sirens screamed, helicopters circled, neighbours huddled in evacuation shelters. The fog that had once haunted the trees was replaced by smoke, acrid and choking. By dawn, the fire had cut a scar through the forest. What had been lush undergrowth was reduced to ash and skeletal trunks. Crews walked the ground, stamping embers, their boots sinking into soot. It was in that blackened silence, among the charred roots of an oak, that one man's shovel struck something solid. The sound was different from stone, a hollow knock, sharp, metallic. The firefighter crouched, brushing aside cinders, expecting a buried pipe. Instead, he uncovered a bundle wedged deep among the roots, a backpack, leather straps blackened but intact, canvas scorched but holding. For a moment, no one spoke. Helmets tilted, gloves stilled, as if the earth itself had coughed up a secret. Then the man said, half to himself, "It's been sitting here, under our boots all this time." The question hung in the smoke. They passed it hand to hand, unwilling to set it down. Dust and ash spilled like breath held too long. The initials stitched into the flap were faint but legible. The boy's, his backpack, the one he had slung across his shoulder that October afternoon 10 years earlier. News spread before the embers cooled. By evening, the site was ringed with yellow tape, investigators crouching with cameras and evidence bags. Reporters pushed against barricades, microphones thrust forward, their voices echoing the same headline, "Backpack found after decade of silence." Neighbours flocked to the edge of the scarred ridge. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered that the fire had not only burned trees but burned away the fog's protection. An old man muttered a rhyme children once chanted at schoolyards, "Fire shows what fog hides." Another shook her head, whispering, "The woods never give without a price." Inside the backpack, investigators found objects too ordinary to explain their weight. A notebook, edges curled from heat, pages still legible in places. A handful of peppermint wrappers melted and fused. A folded scarf, charred but recognizable. And at the bottom, a watch, the family's watch, its glass cracked, hand stopped at 6:17. Each item was logged, photographed, bagged, but their presence raised more questions than answers. If the children had run away, why had their possessions remained buried under roots, untouched for 10 years? If they had been abducted, why were these items returned now, by fire rather than man? The family was summoned to the station that evening. The mother held the backpack in her arms as though it were a child returned. She pressed her lips to the scorched flap, whispering their names. The father turned the watch over, holding it close to his ear, though the tick was long gone. Their surviving daughter traced her fingers along the charred scarf, tears slipping down her face. In the corner, the melted candy wrappers sat in a plastic tray, their faint, sweet smell still clinging to the air. "The woods kept them," the daughter whispered, "and the fire gave them back." Officials spoke carefully at the press conference. "We have recovered belongings consistent with the missing siblings' case. Forensic analysis will determine their condition and potential leads." But their words were drowned out by whispers from the crowd. Whispers that the fire had not only burned trees but burned silence itself, because the wall had kept its secret until it couldn't. The backpack lay under fluorescent light, its scorched canvas stretched across a steel table. Gloves snapped, cameras clicked, investigators circled it as though the bag itself might speak. For 10 years the case had been filed under silence. Now the silence had weight, pressed into leather and soot. The first object lifted was the notebook. Its cover was warped, the edges curled by heat, but most of the pages had survived. The handwriting was careful, small letters pressed into lined paper. At first it was routine, sketches of trails, notes about weather, scribbled maps of the woods with circles drawn around bends in the creek. Then the tone shifted. Halfway through, the entries became sharper, shorter, written as though in haste. Car by the trail again. Noise after dusk. Not an animal. Watch stopped for 2 minutes. Started again. The last page carried the words that froze the room. Fog thick. Man waiting near roots. The line ended mid-stroke, the pencil dragging as though broken or pulled away. Beneath it, indentation marks revealed another faint word pressed into the fibres. Help. Next came the scarf. Charred, edges crisped, but unmistakable. The mother identified it instantly. She had knit it herself the winter before the disappearance, each row of red and grey a labour of evenings spent by the fire. Seeing it laid out on sterile paper, sealed in plastic, broke her composure. "That scarf came off in the woods," she said firmly. "They didn't drop it by choice. Someone set it there." The watch was catalogued next. Its glass was cracked, its hands frozen at 6:17. Forensic analysts noted scratches across the casing, shallow but deliberate. The father, standing behind the glass window, whispered, "It never stopped before. It ticked steady all our lives." Something broke it there, in those woods. His voice trembled but did not falter. Then came the soil. Small clumps clung stubbornly to the bag's seams, not from the wildfire but from years underground. Testing revealed layers, topsoil from the ridge mixed with clay from the creek bed, and, most curiously, traces of ash not from 2020's fire, but from an older burn, dated nearly a decade earlier. It suggested the bag had been buried shallow, moved, perhaps even reburied. Someone had tended its hiding place. Fibres told their own story. Among the threads of canvas and scarf, investigators found strands of coarse blue wool, not matching the children's clothing. They compared samples to archived uniforms and found a possible link: coats once issued to forestry workers phased out years before. If accurate, it meant someone with official access had been near the children in their final moments. The peppermint wrappers were almost overlooked, fused together by heat, but one bore a smudge of ink on the inside, faint letters bleeding into the sugar paper. Under magnification, the mark resembled the start of a name, though too blurred to confirm. The daughter, shown the fragment, said softly, They always wrote little notes to each other, even on candy. Maybe one of them tried to leave us a sign. Each detail pulled the case further from the sheriff's neat theory of probable runaways. If they had left willingly, why did the notebook describe being watched? Why did the scarf appear planted? Why did soil samples suggest the bag had been hidden and moved? The evidence did not whisper escape. It whispered interruption. Reporters pressed the sheriff at a new conference. How do you explain the notebook? The word help, the watch stopped at 6:17. He cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, and offered nothing more than, all evidence is under review. His words felt smaller than the bag itself. For the family, the verdict was already clear. Standing outside the station, the mother held a photograph of the children, her voice breaking but steady. The bag didn't crawl into the ground by itself. Someone put it there, and someone broke the watch that ticked in our home. Her daughter added, "Evidence can illuminate, but it cannot resurrect. We will not get them back, but we will get the truth." The trail to the creek was walked 100 times in the months after the wildfire. Investigators traced it with maps and markers. Journalists traced it with cameras. The family traced it with memory. Each group saw the ground differently, as though the same dirt carried parallel truths. The official reconstruction was clinical. Investigators charted the siblings' last known path, placing flags where the scarf was found, where the compass needle twitched, where the notebook suggested they lingered. The backpack's burial site was marked in bright tape labelled as point of recovery. From these coordinates, officials drew a neat diagram, a route that began at the trailhead, followed the bend in the creek, ended in sudden silence. But neat diagrams do not explain contradictions. Why had the scarf been folded, not torn? Why had the watch stopped at 6:17? Why did the soil show signs of older ash, as though the bag had been buried, moved, then buried again? Officials acknowledged these details only in footnotes. The family's reconstruction was messier, but more human. They walked the trail in silence, their surviving daughter carrying the cracked watch in her palm, listening to the absence of its tick. At the spot where the scarf was found, she knelt, pressing her hand into the dirt. "This wasn't where they fell," she whispered. "This was where someone wanted us to think they fell." Her father disagreed. He believed the scarf had slipped in a struggle, left behind as the children were pulled deeper into the fog. His wife countered, if it was struggle, there would be more. Footprints, broken branches, something. Their debate was not division. It was determination, each voice tugging against the silence, refusing to let the neat line of probable runaways stand unchallenged. Folklore added its own layer. Hunters claimed the woods had always been a place of exchanges, one thing taken, another given. A decade of silence, then a wildfire that returned belongings, not bodies, seemed to fit the old pattern. "The woods only give back what fire demands," an old logger muttered at the diner. To him the backpack was not evidence, it was tribute. Forensic detail and folklore collided hardest around the watch. Investigators saw its cracked face and frozen hands as a timestamp, proof of the moment the children were interrupted. The family heard something else. To them, the watch's silence was not just about 6:17. It was about a rhythm broken, a promise interrupted. And to neighbours steeped in folklore, the watch's loud tick in dreams, its sudden stop in the woods, marked the moment when time itself had been taken. Maps of the trail hung side by side in the sheriff's office, one marked with evidence flags. One scrawled by the family covered in red ink and circled contradictions. On the official map, the route ended cleanly at the creek. On the family's, arrows extended into the forest, branching into questions. Which was more truthful, the map that ended neatly, or the one that refused to end at all? One theory suggested an insider, someone with access to the forestry uniforms that matched the fibers found in the backpack. Another theory suggested the siblings had stumbled onto something illicit in the woods, hidden caches perhaps, or activity officials wanted erased. A third theory, whispered more than spoken, insisted the fire itself was a kind of confession, nature burning away what man had hidden. No single theory satisfied everyone, but all of them circled the same point. The siblings did not simply vanish. Something, or someone, had stopped them. On the 10th anniversary of their disappearance, the family led a group back into the charred forest. Survivors of the search, neighbours, even a few officials walked silently behind them. At the creek bend, the father held up the cracked watch. His daughter raised the scarf. Together they placed them on a stone, the sound of water threading through silence. "If you stood here," the daughter said, her voice carrying over the crowd, "which path would you believe? The one that ends in silence, or the one that keeps asking why?" No one answered. The woods held their breath, because two paths lay before them, one drawn in diagrams, one etched in grief, and neither offered certainty. Two paths, one wall. Zero certainties. The trial never came. There was no suspect to drag into court, no confession to underline the notebook's desperate scrawl. The sheriff's office reopened the file but offered only cautious phrases: active investigation, pending leads, ongoing review. The family had heard them all before. And so the aftermath was not a courtroom. It was a vigil. Neighbours gathered at the scarred trailhead that October, 10 years to the day since the siblings stepped into fog and never returned. Children held lanterns, their glow flickering against the blackened stumps. Ribbons fluttered from the mailbox posts bright against the char. The backpack, preserved in a glass case, rested on a table draped in white cloth. The scarf lay beside it, charred fringe still smelling faintly of smoke, and the watch, its hands frozen at 6:17, ticked only in memory. The mother placed a slice of bread on the table, just as she had done each year at the window. "For supper," she whispered, the words almost swallowed by the wind. The father touched the cracked glass of the watch, his jaw set, his silence louder than grief. Their surviving daughter read aloud from the notebook, her voice trembling at the last unfinished line. "Fog thick, man waiting near roots, help." Reporters captured photographs, but it was the townspeople who carried the weight. For them, the siblings' disappearance was no longer just tragedy. It was a civic wound, a story told with lowered voices. If they were so close all along, why weren't they found? That question outlived headlines. It echoed in classrooms, in diner booths, in church pews. It was written into the town's memory as surely as dates on a calendar, because the wildfire had revealed what years of search could not bodies, not culprits, but proof that silence was not emptiness, it was concealment. Letters began to arrive at the family's house, not bills, not postcards, but handwritten notes from strangers. Some offered condolences, others offered stories of their own: missing children, vanished relatives, secrets that never surfaced. The family kept them all in a box by the window, calling them the letters the future wrote back. Each envelope was proof that absence binds people across time. At the library, a plaque was mounted near the trail maps. It bore the siblings' names, their ages, and a single line: "They walked into fog and were not returned. We will not stop asking why." Visitors paused there, fingers tracing the words, eyes drifting to the dark edge of the woods beyond the window. The town changed in subtle ways. No child walked the trail at dusk without company. No hunter entered the ridge without lighting a lantern first. Teachers told the story not as warning, but as ritual. This place remembers. Do not let it forget. For the family, remembrance became survival. Each October they lit their candle in the window, placed bread on the sill, tied ribbons to the porch rail. And each October, neighbours answered with lanterns of their own. The rituals spread until the valley itself seemed to glow against the fog. Yet even light could not erase the question. The wildfire had burned trees to ash, but why had it taken fire to force the truth into view? Had searchers walked past the buried bag all those years? Had someone tended its hiding place to ensure it would never be found? Was the silence negligence or design? That question burned sharper than grief, because it was not just about the siblings, it was about trust, in officials, in neighbours, in the very ground beneath their feet. The woods still stand, the fog still comes, the creek still winds through stone, but the storm that began on that October afternoon has never ended. It lingers in every lantern, every ribbon, every whispered prayer. Some storms never pass. They wait in stone.